recognize the term black English if you mean what Max Robinson of ABC Evening News speaks, if you mean what Ed Bradley uses, if you mean what Irving Cross and Jane Kennedy and Bryant Gumbel use, that is black English. The English that is spoken by professional speakers or educated black people does not in any significant way differ from what you speak, sir. But what we're talking about is the language of slave descendants of African origin that's acquired in social isolation. It's not English, and I'm not going to call it English. Just that simple.
Okay, Dr. Wilson. I wanted to know, Dr. Smith, whether you thought that this pattern is generalized in other languages besides English. I've heard from the French an expression called petit nègre. I wonder if that has any kind of reference at all to anything that could be acceptable in terms of Ebonics. I know it's not the same as Creole. Creolization is supposed to be another step in the progress, if you will, of development of a language.
Brother, what you have is, again, I'm going to say it one more time. If A and B come into contact, the question is whether or not you get A with a little B in it or whether or not you get B with a little A in it. It's just that simple. The Creole hypothesis submits that at one time there was a pidgin language that was dominant in A with a little African in it, and then it became, after decreolization, all A non-standard dialect of A. I'm saying that it was B in Africa. It has no longer been completely African because of this vocabulary, but on the same continuum, it is still African, brother. It doesn't take a third-grade education to see what Europeans are doing. It's a Eurocentric posture, only operating on weight. The transformationists say that there was no pigeon stage. The blacks were so plastic that they broke with the African tradition immediately and acquired old massive speech. That defies all logic of linguistic ontogeny and acquisition. There's no evidence of white women serving as mammies for slave babies. Anyone who knows anything about language acquisition knows that most human beings learn their language between 0 and 3 years of age, either as simultaneous or successive bilinguals, if you are familiar with those terms. The question now is, if black mammies were around white babies as opposed to white women around black babies, that accounts for your southern white speech sounding like blacks, brother. The black man lives in social isolation hearing black sounds, and the black man in the United States in social isolation retains those African sounds until he is crackified in public schools or lives upside white people, and then you get that.
Would you have any evidence that it does exist? For example, the Ebonics exist in Haiti or in Martinique and Guadeloupe?
Well, according to Heinz Johann in his book Montu, he suggests that in the African world, on page 194, and I'll quote verbatim what he says, in the Afro-American world, some hybrid languages have arisen. Creole, Suriname, Papiamento, and others, which are generally designated as dialects. Creole counts as spoiled English, spoiled French. Suriname is called Negro English. The vocabulary consists predominantly of European words, but the syntax and word formation follow the rules of African grammar. It is wrong, therefore, to call these languages spoiled English or spoiled French. If one considers the essence of a language to be its vocabulary, Creole and Papiamento must be called the youngest of the Romance languages. Suriname must be called the youngest of the Germanic languages. But if one considers the vocabulary, the grammatical structure of a language more important than its vocabulary, then the three languages mentioned do not belong to the Indo-European group. So we find the same thing going on. You have Schutkart and Hesslerling and all of these early Creolists, Hall and Bailey and Stewart, all of these Zionists of U.S. imperialism who go into African subtropical communities throughout the world and positing a Eurocentric view of these languages, which in no way correspond to the grammar of European languages.
Mr. Rand.
Yes, one of the most important studies that has been done was Lorenzo Turner's early study, yes, Africanisms in the Gullah dialect.
Yes, sir.
I wonder what current field studies are being done in that way and how these studies are being used. What academic recognition are they being given?
I can only address myself to my own work because I'm more familiar with my work than any others. I've been invited by the government of Niger and the government of Sierra Leone and Kenya to come there this summer and stay for a whole year, expenses fully paid by those three governments, to continue the work that I'm doing in reestablishing this linguistic continuity of the African diaspora. What we're looking at is a diasporalect of African languages, not a pidgin or a Creole. Pidgin theory subsumes that there has been a rupture in the African language tradition. Let me call your attention to a work by a black man by the name of Merlin Allen, Linguistic Continuity of Africa in the Caribbean. On page 125, he mentions here, the process by which African elements have entered Afro-American dialects and by which they were transmitted seems to be a crucial question. A look at Indo-European linguistics may be of some interest. The most prevalent view concerning the basis for genetic classification in Indo-European linguistics is that continuity of morphology constitutes a relevant evidence for positing genetic relationship. For example, there has been linguistic continuity in Western Europe in terms of the transmission of Latin morphology in somewhat altered form, or by transmission of Old Germanic morphology. This makes languages like French and Spanish, etc., genetically related to Latin, German, Dutch, etc., genetically related to Old German. There has been no rupture in the development or transmission process, although obviously there has been change. English itself is considered to be a continuation of Anglo-Saxon and in turn of Old Germanic, although in fact the vocabulary is predominantly Latin. If we find African elements in Afro-American dialects, the conclusion is inescapable that they belong to the base of the historical process. If we find an almost total absence of Indo-European morphology in African-American dialects, but instead find that the morphosyntax can, in many respects, be shown to be derived from the morphosyntax of West African languages, we can reasonably conclude that there is a morphosyntactical continuity from West African languages to Afro-American dialects. But, as I have said, the way in which the genesis of Creole languages has been presented in much of the current work implies a break in any linguistic continuity with Africa. The implication is that African and African slaves gave up the African languages, i.e., that broke with the African linguistic tradition and accepted a pidgin, primarily a European invention, a simplified version of the European language. To relate non-standard dialects of black urban communities to a pidgin would lead to the inference that there has been discontinuity as far as the transmission of African cultural item is concerned, and would in fact support the deficiency hypothesis.
We get another perspective. We're moving out of time. Yes,
I'd like to find out.
Again.
Yeah. You have explained at least certain phonological patterns that you feel are definitely African in what you call Ebonics. Leaving lexical items aside, which I think we both agree are rather superficial, I'd like to know at least what other features you feel, and obviously this is kind of new business, so what other features you feel are definitely present in what you call Ebonics that show African heritage, and if in fact you can point to specific African heritages.
Okay. There is also on the board here, going back to this same thing, this statement contains three very distinct African non-Germanic or English patterns. First you have that teacher, she, me. If you look at the lexeme, that teacher, she, me, we have here what is called a recapitulative pronoun. This is a topic and a comment, and the comment contains a recapitulative pronoun. If you were to say that this was a noun phrase and a verb phrase, first of all, there's no copula, there is a CV vocalic pattern, and now you have a recapitulative pronoun that would be considered by anybody who knows a lick of English too many subjects in the noun phrase. My brother Charles, he played football. My brother Charles is the topic, the comment, he played football. That's similar to the Asiatic language, Japanese. Anata no namae wa nan desu ka. That means, speaking of your name, the verb comes at the end, what is it? Awatashi no namae wa sumisu one desu. Speaking of my name, it's Ernie Smith. Okay? Taishiba wa doko desu ka. Speaking of the station, where is it? We're talking about topics and comments versus noun phrases and verb phrases. It is incorrect to use terms that refer to Indo-European syntax, terms handed us by Aristotle and Plato and Pianini and all the early Indo-European grammarians to try to describe a non-Indo-European phenomenon. I have asked the director to give us some slides to show what I mean about the morphology, asexual verb system, which Brother Boateng mentioned earlier, that distinguishes the African language. So if he will bring those slides on, I will give you some examples. As I said earlier, the Indo-European language is dominant in tense, its particular past and present. There are 8 forms of the verb be in English: is, am, are, was, were, be, being, and been. These verbs, though they may have been borrowed into African speech, do not function in African speech as they function in the European language that is called Standard English. African languages are aspectual. Let's go to the